Today we're going to do a little background work toward the War for Independence by looking at some of the things that occurred from the early colonial times up until the point where the fighting begins, and by looking at some different charts concerning colonial growth and so on. So let's look at a couple things here. That may be difficult for you to see the graph part, but hopefully up here you can see the population of different cities. So, you have a question?
Do we need to have a new packet?
Not yet.
Okay.
We're not taking notes on this. It's just for reflection, thinking. Okay. So, from the years 1690 through 1775. Here's the growth of different cities: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. All right, take a look at that. Let's see if we can make some observations. What do you notice, Stephen?
New York grew substantially from 1730 to 1780 or 60.
Right. So New York grew a lot. New York was the second lowest of the four, or third highest of the four cities. So they grew up to the second highest. Okay. Who grew the most? Philadelphia, from 4,000 all the way up to 40,000, far surpassing the other cities. So the question we would ask is what?
Why?
Why? Why did Philadelphia grow so much more than even New York? New York grew a lot, but why did Philadelphia grow more?
Location?
That's usually the case. So what about Philadelphia's location would have caused growth? That may be, because New York has a better harbor. They've got more harbor area. Philadelphia does have a harbor, but Philadelphia does open up into Pennsylvania all the farmland that's there. So that may very well be the reason why it grew. Of course, that would mean people didn't go on out to the farmland. They settled in the city. Anything else you can think of? All right, any other observations? Devin?
Between 1760 and 1775, Boston hardly grows at all.
Right. Yeah, look at that. From here to here, not much at all. Compared with New York, especially compared with Philadelphia and Charleston. So what do you think the reason for that is? Why did Boston not grow that much in those years? What do you think, Michaela?
Was it after like the earthquake and the outbreak of
It would have been after that. I'm not sure that that greatly affected their growth. Maybe. I mean, maybe with the diphtheria going through, maybe that cut the population enough that any growth was not a lot. Any other things you can think of? Think of location of Boston. Boston geographically doesn't lend itself to growing. It has water on several sides, so there's only one way it can go, and there are already towns there. So Boston itself was limited by its geographical size, so that it's not going to grow a lot in numerical size. You follow what I'm saying? Whereas Philadelphia could keep growing out as well as numerically, New York as well. Any other observations? Okay, those are pretty good. Let's go on down to, oh, something broke. Oh boy, this is hard to see. That is dairy cattle. So yellow is dairy cattle, that's tobacco, and that's rice and indigo. All right, maybe you can make out some of the other ones here too. But what do you notice on this map? What would you say about dairy farming? Dairy farming. What? A lot of dairy farming. Okay, what else? Stephen?
It's not only on the coast.
Right, it's not only on the coast. You can see that as people get away from the coastal area, they still are dairy farming. All right, what about tobacco? What do you notice about it? Devin?
I think it's concentrated mostly in one spot.
Yeah, just one area down here, Virginia, North Carolina primarily. Now, that's not to say they didn't grow tobacco in Maryland and Delaware and so on, but this is where it's dominant. Okay, what about rice and indigo? Well, let me ask you, because back to tobacco. Why? Why is it primarily in this area down here? What do you think, Steph?
Like maybe like the temperature, like the climate.
Right. Tobacco, even though they did grow some tobacco all the way up in Boston, it didn't grow as well. It grows a lot better in a southern climate. Okay, then what about rice and indigo? What do you observe about that? Sahana?
It's mainly South Carolina.
Yeah, some in North Carolina and mostly in South Carolina. Why is that? Must have to do with climate as well, weather. So what is it about the weather down here that makes it conducive to growing rice and indigo, especially rice? Let's think about.
It's a lot warmer.
It's a lot warmer, so it takes a warm climate to grow rice, doesn't it? What else does it take a lot of? Moisture, rain. So a lot of rain and it's warm. Okay, what else? Well, let's see. We see whaling here. Where do you see whaling? Up around Boston area, because this is where whales congregate in the Atlantic, North Atlantic. Fishing. See, that's a lot of that's up in here too. In fact, people were fishing in this area long before any settlers came. Anything else stand out to you? What about lumber? Can you see lumber?
In a lot of places.
A lot of places. Which tells you what about North America at that time? A lot of trees, right? Okay, see anything else? Okay. Now, this is looking at the areas that were settled. First, 1660, I think that says, in brown. So notice where people lived in 1660. Some along here, a little bit here, and along here. Then by 1700, not that long after, people are living in the yellow areas here. See, they're moving away from the coast a little bit here, up into here. And then by 1750, notice where they're living. They're getting further and further away from the coast in some areas. Interesting, this area is not settled, but out here it is, because out here's where there are rivers. Now you think about 1750, that's the time when we're moving toward our war for independence during the French and Indian War. And notice that people are living in a very confined area, really, if you think about it. You know, we think about the 13 colonies are going against England, but, you know, not many people living out in the western parts of those colonies. Now, this is looking at the slave trade. I think we talked about it before, but this became a major factor in the 18th century. You can see slaves are originating down here, Angola, and on up the coast, and coming from there mostly over to South America. We see, and that is the Portuguese. The Portuguese are bringing them over to Brazil, which is owned by Portugal. Let's see, then the French, they're getting slaves from along this coast and bringing over to French colonies, like Haiti here, New Orleans. The Dutch are bringing them from same two areas to South America because that's where they own land in South America as well. And you see the British then are bringing slaves to the Caribbean area and then from there to North America, especially the South. And that was profitable business. But only part of what's called the triangle trade, which brings slaves from Africa to America, sometimes coming here and then sending them further north, along with molasses, and you see some other products in there too. And then from North America, farm products were sent to Britain, tobacco was sent to Britain, fish and rum sent to Europe, and then manufactured goods are sent back to America. Because America at that time didn't really have much manufacturing. They would send the natural products to particularly England, and then they would manufacture goods out of them and send them back and sell them back to the Americans. Now, as colonists continue to move a little, westward from where they live, away from the coast, there's more and more encounters with the Indians, and a lot of that turns out to not be friendly. As we get into the war between Great Britain and France, which in America was called the French and Indian War, we find that the Indians are going to side with the French for the most part in fighting against the British, which would include the American colonists, who were considered British. And that is largely because the French didn't take land. The French weren't interested in farming communities. They were out there trapping just like the Indians were. So they would work side by side with the Indians, where the British were taking over areas and cutting down the trees for farming. 1622, there was a great massacre. Powhatan attacked a Virginia settlement, killing 350 colonists, which is a third of the population. So it can be quite devastating. More than 1,640 New Englanders were taken hostage by Indians between 1675 and 1763. And you've read a couple of accounts of people that were taken hostage. But people continued to move westward because there was land out there that was available. Now, these are some of the sites of battles of the French and Indian War. You can see all the way from Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee, North Carolina, but especially in Western Virginia and Maryland, up into Pennsylvania, a number of battles in Pennsylvania, some up here in New York, and other places as well, up in Canada, all the way out into Indiana and Illinois, up in Wisconsin. And these Western battles were primarily because the British had forts out there and they were attacked by the French and the Indians. Pennsylvania is close to us, and that's where a lot of the battles took place and you can see them listed on here. The closest to us is what was by the French called Fort Duquesne. When the British seized it, they named it after William Pitt, Prime Minister. It became Fort Pitt, and today we know it as Pittsburgh, right? City of Champions,
Yeah.
Pittsburgh. And there's there's a place in Pittsburgh that you can see some historical indications of what was there at the point between where the Monongahela and Allegheny Rivers come together to form the Ohio. In that area, I've not been there, but there's I think a building, which I'm not sure if it's an original one or not, but there's some things there. And I know down here at Fort Necessity, there are some things to see as well. In Pittsburgh, because it was such a pivotal place in the war, at the History Museum, American History Museum at Pittsburgh, they focus a lot on the French and Indian War, more so than any museum I've ever been in. So it's very interesting because it ties in with the local area. And you can also see things there celebrating the Pittsburgh sports teams. So there's an area for the Steelers and the Pirates. You can listen to old Pirates games from the 60s and so on. And they also have an area dedicated to Mr. Rogers. So if you want to do that. There's an area that also shows what life was like back in, well, I think it's the early 1900s. There's a trolley there you can get on and see what that was like and see what buildings were like and so on. So it's a nice little museum. Now the French had some advantages when they went to war with the British, in that they had better relations with the Indians. They had a better understanding of guerrilla warfare, which the Indians were good at, hiding behind trees and rocks and stuff instead of standing out in the open and shooting and then taking off. And the advantage of the disunity of the British colonies, because the colonies didn't cooperate with one another. Yeah, they're all British, they're all fighting on the British side, but it was, the British were in part dependent on militias from the different states, and they didn't often help each other at all. If something happened in Pennsylvania, people in Maryland said, who cares, for example. The British had advantages, and they outnumbered the French 20-1. And their navy controlled the waterways, and they had a vested interest. That is, people lived here. The French, if they got kicked out, they could just move to other areas and still trap beavers and stuff. But there are actually cities established, more so than the French, and people living here. So those are some of the advantages and disadvantages of each side as they begin to fight one another in America. Any questions or comments about the advantages each had? Here's some of the major battles. There's several wars that take place between the British and the English over the years. I said British and English? British and the French over the years. There's King William's War, King George's War, and then what we call the French and Indian War. Queen Anne's War takes place before that. So you can see battles that occurred there. Mostly, these wars were fought other places. The French and Indian War, or the British and the French end up calling it the 7 Years' War, is the first conflict between the British and the French that started in America. The other ones kind of spilled over into America, but this one started here, and it started with George Washington's expedition to Fort Duquesne to tell the French to leave. And I think you've read something about that in your text. So here's a battle at Fort Necessity, Fort Duquesne, Fort Niagara. You may have visited there on the way to Toronto. Fort Ticonderoga would play a big part in our war for independence, but also was a battle during the French and Indian War. And my favorite, Fort William Henry.
Yeah.
Yeah, great place. I've been there once.
Legend.
When I was in my 20s. And I signed, they had a ledger to sign in your name. And I thought, they probably think someone's just making a joke, signing William Henry at Fort William Henry, but it really was. It really is my name.
It'll be my son's
Here's a closer look at some of the victories of the British advance, and the French victories as well. And as you know, the French controlled all this area up here, which is largely Canada. The British, this. George Washington was involved in the very beginning of this conflict, as you read, as you know, in leading a military expedition from Virginia to Fort Duquesne. Virginia claimed that, even though it's in Pennsylvania, Virginia claimed that area, and so the governor sent Washington to tell the French to leave. Before he got there, he also had some Indians with him, and those Indians were just itching for a fight. For some reason, they didn't like the French. And so when they came upon a French delegation, it was actually sent by the French, and they were going on their way to Virginia to try to work out a settlement between the two. But Washington didn't know that, and the Indians were with him, attacked them while they were resting. And so they got into a battle. Washington ended up having to retreat back to Fort Necessity, and it's called that because he built it out of necessity. You know, he was on the run, built this fort. Now, looking at this fort right here, is there, can you see any disadvantages with building it right there?
low.
It's in a low place,
In woods, with woods from
so why would being in a low place be a problem?
gives other people high ground.
Yeah, so the French are up here higher ground, they can just shoot down at them. And I think somebody else mentioned another factor.
Flooding.
Yeah, you saw the water laying here. It's in a low-lying area, so, and it rained a lot, and so there was a lot of water down in here. So it wasn't a great place for a fort at all, and they were not successful in defending it. Washington lost to the French, and had to sign an agreement that he was the one that started the fight and that he would never fight against them again. But that didn't happen.
Savage.
There's a contemporary picture of the battlefield.
Very small.
Yeah, very small fort. It was put up in a hurry. And I don't know if this is probably not the original. They probably built another one like it, but it would have been similar to that. Only there was more water lying around. Here's what the British soldiers look like, and the French soldiers. Typical Indian with his rifle.
Oh wow.
And this shows how they generally fought. They lined up shoulder to shoulder and fired at the other side, lined up shoulder to shoulder. That was the European way of doing it. And after you fired into their ranks and hopefully hit a few of them, then you would charge with bayonets. It would be a bayonet fight.
Yeah.
But what the British found out in the very first battle that Washington was involved with William Braddock, who was the British commander who then led a force against Fort Duquesne, was that the French didn't fight that way in America. They did over in Europe, but in America they fought more like the Indians, hiding behind trees and rocks and things, and the British thought this is not fair. They're hiding. No, come up and fight like a man. No. And they're, the people are falling all around them. Come out and fight. No, they weren't doing it. And Washington tried to advise Braddock, look, it's different here. You can't fight European style. And Braddock wouldn't listen, and Braddock got killed. Here's a painting of the battle. You can see the Indians are hiding, and the British are standing out here in the open. And there's the death of Braddock. Actually called the Battle of Monongahela, 1755. Now, it's interesting what George Washington wrote in a letter to his brother concerning this battle. Devin, can you read that?
Sure. But by the all-powerful dispensations of Providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation. For I had 4 bullets through my coat, and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me.
All right, so when he got back, he found 4 bullet holes in his coat. He had 2 horses shot out from under him, and yet he wasn't hurt. And people were falling all around him. He attributed that to God's protection. It was accentuated even more 15 years later when Washington was out in that area. Again, an Indian chief came to meet him, and this is what he said to him. Would someone like to read this? Oh man. Basically, he said this: I told my braves to fire at you because you were a leader, and if you fell, they would all run. He said, and time after time we fired at you and never to bring you down. I told them to finally stop firing because apparently the Great Spirit is protecting this man for something later on.
Yeah.